something shifted, and almost no one noticed. Not at first. There was no press conference. No official statement. No dramatic headline screaming across your screen. Just a quiet, almost invisible move, one click, one decision, one unfollow. But in a world where power hides behind silence, sometimes the smallest actions carry the loudest message, because this wasn't just anyone. This involved one of the most powerful figures in global entertainment, and a name that has never truly left the spotlight. At first glance, it seemed trivial. Social media activity changes every second. People follow, unfollow, move on. It's noise. It's nothing. But this felt different. Because behind that single action, there was a story. A story that had been building for months. Maybe even years. A story filled with ambition, image, loyalty, and something far more uncomfortable. Not the kind you see coming. Not the kind that explodes overnight. But the kind that grows slowly, quietly, beneath carefully crafted appearances. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't just damage reputations. It rewrites them. The public image was perfect. A global figure stepping into new territory. A partnership that promised innovation, storytelling, and influence. It looked like a new chapter, bold, inspiring, unstoppable. But behind the polished interviews and strategic smiles, something wasn't aligning. Something wasn't adding up. Because while the world was watching the headlines, a different narrative was forming in the background. One that didn't fit the script. And then came the voice that changed everything. Not a tabloid. Not a rumor. A detailed account. Sharp. Precise. Uncomfortable. The kind of account that doesn't just raise questions. It forces people to start connecting dots they didn't even know existed. And suddenly, that quiet unfollow didn't seem so small anymore. It started to feel like a signal. A response. Maybe even a reaction. Think about that. Why would someone at the top, someone who understands perception better than most, make such a subtle yet visible move? What did they see that the public didn't? Or maybe the better question is, what had they already known? Because if this was just business, it would have stayed behind closed doors. But it didn't. Something slipped through, and now, people are starting to look closer. At the partnerships. At the timing. At the promises that were made, and the expectations that were never fully met. But that's not even the most unsettling part. The real tension lies somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Because this isn't just about contracts or content deals. It's about something that was supposed to stand for honor, resilience, and trust. Something that meant more than headlines. And now, that very thing is being pulled into the center of the storm. So the question isn't just what happened, the question is, what really went wrong? And more importantly, who knew it was coming before everyone else did? Because once you start uncovering the truth behind this story, you realize that the unfollow wasn't the beginning. It was the warning. Long before the silence, before the subtle signals, before that quiet unfollow, there was excitement. A new alliance had formed. One that, on paper, looked almost unstoppable. On one side, a global streaming giant. A company that had reshaped how the world consumed stories. A platform built on data, precision, and one ruthless expectation, results. And on the other, a figure who had already mastered attention. Not just media attention. Global attention. Every move watched. Every word analyzed. Every appearance dissected. It felt like the perfect match. Storytelling power meets real-world narrative. A chance to turn influence into legacy. At least, that's how it was sold. The deal wasn't just about content. It was about meaning. About creating something that could resonate beyond entertainment. Projects that would inspire, uplift, maybe even redefine how stories of struggle and triumph are told. And at the center of it all was a promise. A promise tied to something deeply personal. Something that carried emotional weight far beyond business. Because this wasn't just another production opportunity. It was connected to a cause. A global initiative that had, for years, stood as a symbol of resilience, of strength in the face of adversity. A movement that wasn't built on fame, but on sacrifice. And that's where things began to get complicated. At first, everything seemed aligned. Public appearances reinforced the narrative. Speeches echoed the mission. The messaging was clear, consistent, carefully crafted. But behind the scenes, there were delays, missed expectations, projects that were announced but never quite materialized the way they were supposed to. And in an industry driven by momentum, silence can be dangerous. Because silence raises questions. Quietly at first, then louder. What's happening behind the curtain? Why isn't the content coming through? Where's the impact that was promised? And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because while the public saw intention, insiders started to notice hesitation. A gap between what was being presented and what was actually being delivered. Think about that. In a world where perception is everything, what happens when perception starts to drift away from reality? It doesn't collapse all at once. It cracks. Slowly. And those cracks don't stay hidden forever. There were whispers. Conversations that never made it to headlines. Concerns raised in rooms that don't allow cameras. Questions about direction, about commitment, about priorities. But still, nothing official. Nothing concrete. Just a growing sense that something wasn't right. And then came the turning point. Not loud. Not explosive. But sharp enough to cut through the silence. A narrative began to emerge, one that challenged everything people thought they understood about this partnership. Not just about business, but about intention. Because when a story starts to shift from inspiration to doubt, from purpose to performance, people start looking for answers. And this time, they weren't just looking at what was happening now. They started digging into what had already happened. And what they found changed the direction of the entire conversation. Because suddenly, this wasn't about delays or creative differences anymore. It was about something far more serious. Something that, if true, wouldn't just damage a deal. It would raise a question no one was ready to ask. Was this ever about the cause at all? Or was something else quietly taking its place all along? And just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more complicated, a revelation surfaced. One that didn't just add to the tension. It flipped it entirely. At first, it didn't look like a twist. It looked like clarification, like someone simply adding more detail to a story that already existed. But the deeper people went, the more they realized this wasn't clarification, it was contradiction. Because everything that had once felt aligned, suddenly didn't. The narrative that had been carefully built around purpose and authenticity started to feel staged. Not entirely false, but not entirely true either. And that difference? That's where everything began to unravel. A voice entered the conversation, calm, detailed, and disturbingly confident. Not emotional. Not reactive. Just precise. The kind of voice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And what it presented wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic accusations thrown recklessly into the air. Instead, it was something far more unsettling, a slow dismantling of the image people had accepted for so long. Piece by piece, moment by moment, decision by decision, a different version of events began to take shape. Think about that for a second. What happens when the story you believed in doesn't collapse overnight, but instead quietly shifts until you no longer recognize it? Because that's exactly what was happening here. The focus turned toward the very thing that had once been presented as the emotional core of the entire partnership. The cause. The mission. The symbol of resilience that had earned global respect. And suddenly, questions began to surface, not from critics on the outside, but from observers who had once believed in it completely. Questions about priorities. About presence. about whether the spotlight had slowly drifted away from the cause and onto something else entirely. And this is where the contrast became impossible to ignore. On one side, there was the public image, powerful speeches, carefully curated appearances, moments designed to inspire. On the other side, there were gaps, absences, decisions that didn't quite align with the message being delivered. It wasn't one big mistake. It was a pattern. Subtle, but consistent. And patterns are dangerous, because once people see them, they can't unsee them. The expectations had been clear from the beginning. This wasn't just about telling stories. It was about honoring something bigger than any individual. Something that required consistency, commitment, and above all, authenticity. But now, authenticity itself was being questioned. And that changed everything. Because once doubt enters the conversation, it doesn't leave quietly. It grows. It spreads. It forces people to look back at moments they once ignored and ask, was that real? Or was it part of something else? The most unsettling part wasn't what was being said. It was how much of it started to make sense. Connections that once seemed random now felt intentional. Decisions that once seemed harmless now carried weight. And slowly, the entire story began to shift from one of inspiration to one of perception. And that's when the real tension kicked in. Because if perception had been carefully managed from the start, then what else had been? The partnership, the promises, the public image, it all began to feel like pieces of a much larger puzzle. One that no one had fully seen before. And just as people started to grasp the possibility that things weren't what they seemed, another layer surfaced. One that didn't just challenge the narrative. It challenged the motive behind it. And that's where the story stopped being uncomfortable and started becoming impossible to ignore. By now, the cracks weren't subtle anymore. They were visible. And once something becomes visible, it invites scrutiny. Not just from critics, but from people who once supported the story without question. The same audience that had embraced the message, shared the moments, believed in the mission, they were now looking again. But this time, they weren't watching with admiration. They were watching with doubt. Because the deeper this went, the more it started to feel like two completely different realities were colliding. One crafted for the public, and one that existed behind closed doors. And somewhere between those two realities, the truth was hiding. The second twist didn't come from a new claim. It came from a realization. A quiet but powerful one. That maybe this wasn't about a single decision or a few missed expectations. Maybe it was about something far more calculated. A slow shift in focus. A gradual repositioning of what mattered and what didn't. Because when people began revisiting past moments, appearances, interviews, commitments, they noticed something unsettling. A pattern of control. Not control in the obvious sense. Not forceful. Not aggressive. Strategic. Moments where attention subtly shifted. Where the spotlight didn't stay where it was expected to. Where something meaningful was quietly overshadowed by something more personal, more image-driven. And that raises a difficult question. When a cause becomes part of someone's identity, where does the cause end and the identity begin? Think about that. Because if the line between purpose and personal brand starts to blur, then every action begins to carry a different weight. Every appearance, every decision, it's no longer just about impact. It's about perception. And perception can be managed. That's where the discomfort really sets in. Because the more this pattern revealed itself, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that something once genuine had slowly been repurposed. Not abandoned. Not completely replaced. But redirected. And that creates a moral tension that's impossible to ignore. On one side, you have a cause built on real struggle, real sacrifice, real stories that deserve to be told with honesty and respect. On the other side, you have influence, powerful, global, capable of amplifying that cause to unimaginable levels. But what happens when amplification turns into ownership? When telling the story becomes controlling the story? That's the dilemma. Because influence can elevate, but it can also reshape. And sometimes, it reshapes things in ways that were never intended. Behind the scenes, this tension didn't go unnoticed. People close to the situation, those who understood the stakes, began to question not just what was happening, but why it was happening this way. Concerns weren't just about results anymore. They were about direction. About integrity. About whether the original purpose was still intact or slowly being rewritten. And here's the part that makes this even more complex. No one came forward with a dramatic accusation. There was no explosive confrontation, just distance. Subtle shifts, small changes in behavior that, on their own, might seem insignificant, but together, they tell a story words don't need to explain. And suddenly, that quiet unfollow from earlier starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a decision, a calculated one. Because when people at the top begin to step back without saying a word, it usually means they've already seen enough. Yet even then, the biggest question still remained unanswered. If this was all true, if the story had really shifted this far, then why did it take so long for anyone to notice? And more importantly, what finally pushed everything to the edge? And then, it finally tipped. Not with an explosion, but with a shift so undeniable, it couldn't be ignored anymore. Up until this point, everything had lived in the space of doubt, questions, patterns, interpretations. But now, something changed. The conversation moved from maybe to what if this is actually true? And when that happens, the reaction is never quiet. It starts with a few voices, then more, until suddenly, everyone is looking at the same thing, but seeing it differently than before. The narrative had lost control. Think about how powerful that is. When a story is carefully built over time, it depends on consistency, on belief, on the audience staying aligned with what they're being shown. But the moment that alignment breaks, everything becomes unstable. And that's exactly what happened. Public perception began to split. Some held onto the original image, defending it, protecting it, refusing to believe something deeper could be wrong. But others started pulling at the threads, questioning decisions that once seemed harmless, re-examining moments that now felt off. And the more they looked, the more they found, not necessarily hard proof, not something you could point to and say, this is it, but something more powerful, a feeling, a growing sense that things didn't add up. In today's world, that feeling spreads faster than facts. People don't just react to evidence, they react to perception. And perception had changed. The partnership that once symbolized potential now felt uncertain. The promises that once inspired now felt distant. And the silence, the same silence that once protected the image, was now making things worse. Because silence, in moments like this, doesn't feel neutral. It feels like avoidance, and that raises the stakes even higher. Now it's not just about what happened, it's about why no one is addressing it, why there's no clarity, no direct response, no attempt to close the gap between what people are seeing and what they're being told. And that absence? It creates space. Space for speculation, for interpretation, for narratives no one can fully control anymore. This is where the pressure peaks. Behind the scenes, decisions have to be made, not public ones, but strategic ones, distancing, reevaluating, reconsidering what this association means moving forward. Because at this level, everything is calculated, every connection, every move, every silence. And when a connection starts to carry more risk than value, it doesn't end loudly, it fades. Quietly. Deliberately. Just like that unfollow. But here's the part that makes this even more intense. While the public is trying to figure out what's real, the people involved are already thinking ahead, damage control, reputation management, future positioning. This isn't just about one moment, it's about what comes next. Can the image be repaired? Can the narrative be redirected? Or has something already shifted too far to ever go back? And maybe the biggest question of all, was this a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control, or was this the moment where everything that had been carefully hidden finally caught up with reality? Because once a story reaches this point, it doesn't just end, it transforms, and not always in the way anyone expected. And now, we're left with something far more complicated than a scandal. We're left with a question of identity. Because when a story like this reaches its final stage, it stops being about individual moments and starts becoming about meaning. About what it all represents, beyond headlines, beyond speculation, beyond the noise. What was this really about? Was it a genuine attempt to build something impactful that slowly lost direction? Or was the direction always clear, just not in the way people assumed? Because the truth is, stories like this don't collapse overnight. They evolve. They adapt. They shift just enough to survive, until one day, they don't. And when that moment comes, what remains isn't just the damage, it's the realization. The realization that perception can be powerful, but it's also fragile, that influence can open doors, but it can also blur intentions, and that when something meaningful becomes part of a larger image, it risks being reshaped in ways no one openly admits. Think about that. Because this isn't just about one partnership, or one decision, or one quiet signal that caught people's attention. It's about something deeper. It's about trust. The kind of trust that isn't built through statements or appearances, but through consistency, through alignment between what's said and what's actually done. And once that alignment is questioned, everything changes. Now, the future stands at a crossroads. One path leads to reinvention, a chance to step back, recalibrate, and rebuild something that feels real again, something grounded in purpose rather than perception. But that path requires acknowledgement. It requires clarity. And most importantly, it requires change. The other path? Silence. Letting the story fade, allowing time to soften the edges, hoping that attention moves on before deeper questions demand real answers. But here's the problem with silence. It doesn't erase doubt. It preserves it. And over time, doubt has a way of becoming the story itself. Because people remember how something felt, not just what was said. And right now, what this feels like is unfinished. Unresolved. Like a truth that came too close to the surface, and then stopped. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, not what we know, but what we almost know. Because somewhere between the public image and the private reality, there's a version of this story that hasn't fully been told, a version that explains the decisions, the distance, the quiet shifts that spoke louder than any statement ever could. And until that version comes into the light, the questions won't disappear. They'll wait, in the background, growing louder with time. So the next time you see something small, something subtle, something easy to dismiss, pause for a moment. Look closer. Because sometimes, the biggest stories don't begin with announcements. They begin with silence. And sometimes, silence is the only clue you get.